A fascination of the mind, searching for the elements of sustained engagement. There is an association between engagement and engagement and persuasion. Engagement does not automatically lead to a change in intention, but it seems to be a necessary condition for the acquisition of new beliefs. The question is then, how can we make media experiences more engaging? To understand how engagement works, the first step is to define it. Then, understand whether there is a difference between engagement and related terms such as absorption, transportation, immersion, and flow. I suspected that there isn't truly one and that all these terms refer to the same phenomenon. There is a consensus on the use of the term narrative transportation as the preferred one to describe the phenomenon of narrative engagement. In their transportation imagery model, Green and Brock define narrative transportation as a mental state during which, as a result of an intense focus of attention on the events of a story, a reader feels transported into the world of that story to the point that she stops paying attention to her surroundings. Even the self may seem to disappear, at least temporarily, replaced with another person's identity. Immersion is a term preferred for games and immersive media. Goryu and Kiza make immersion a form of cognitive and affective absorption into digital content characterized by an illusion of reality and a suspension of disbelief. They acknowledge the use of the term toward describing non-technologically based activities and thus propose that immersion should be considered a continuum toward presence and flow. Yim and colleagues make immersion a degree of absorption and engrossment in virtual systems, while Sheen defines immersion as becoming physically or virtually part of the experience itself. As for absorption, Green and Brock make absorption both a tendency to enter a psychological state marked by a reorganization of the self, but also the psychological state that defines narrative transportation. Slater uses the term as a loose synonym of narrative transportation. Van Leyer and colleagues also make absorption a trait that signals one tendency to immerse in vicarious experiences and propose transportation to be the engrossment into a narrative. Hamby, Brimber, and Jacquard propose that absorption refers to the process of relocating oneself within a story and make transportation, identification, and engagement mechanisms of absorption, while the laws of self-awareness, presence, and reflection become a consequence of absorption. Csikszentmihalyi proposes that during an experience of flow, a term that he coined, the person's attention is completely absorbed by the activity, thus suggesting that flow is a superlative form of absorption and involvement. Flow is not specific to any media, but can be born from all kinds of experiences. Csikszentmihalyi defines flow as a state of high creativity, happiness, satisfaction, and a sense of belongingness to something greater than the self, coming from the absorption into a task that is both challenging, intrinsically rewarding, and so involving that it leads to a loss of self-awareness and the purging of irrelevant thoughts. Following this definition, Green and Brock make transportation a form of flow related to narratives. So do Sukala and colleagues. Hemari and colleagues make engagement an experience that combines high concentration and enjoyment and approximates that of flow. North, Forfeld, and Reimersdahl equate flow to complete immersion. As for the word engagement itself, the term is used throughout the literature to describe the way media content arrests attention and thus as a loose synonym for absorption, involvement, immersion, and even flow across media. Recent publications have proposed reconciling all these terms, at least in regards to narrative engagement. Following these integrative views, it seems safe to propose that at their core, if not in the details, all these terms refer to the same phenomenon, which I define as follows. A fascination of the mind leading to a loss of awareness of one's surroundings. Coming from a sustained focus of attention on the task at hand in the expectation of a payout. This payout is necessary because both attention and time are scarce resources. The term presence deserves a special consideration, though. Presence has been defined as a sensation of being there, transported by a mediated experience to a location different to one's physical location. Although the illusion of detachment is not exclusive of a mediated experience, the sensation of being into the world created by that experience is. Also, in the case of narratives, presence is a consequence of engagement because we don't feel transported into the world of a story until we engage with that story. While in the case of immersive media, the illusion of presence is a precursor of engagement. Now, let's break down my definition in terms of cognitive psychology. By a fascination of the mind, I mean that literally. The mind becomes fascinated by an activity to the point that the thoughts inspired by that activity become the sole occupants of consciousness. In relation to narratives, Green and Brock explained that the sensation of transportation and the resulting loss of awareness come from how all mental systems and capacities become focused on events occurring in the narrative. Consuming a story certainly requires active cognitive efforts to produce the mental imagery suggested, extract meaning, and produce a number of speculative thoughts in response to the events portrayed. However, it is not quite correct to say that all mental systems become occupied when engaged. Our brains continue receiving information from the senses. What occurs is that attentional mechanisms obeying to the emotional relevance of a stimulus dictate which sensory information to attend and which to ignore. Sensory information that would prevent the mind from leaving the physical world and entering that of an engaging experience escapes consciousness because consciousness does not hold the contents of the entire brain. Consciousness storage capacity is limited by that of working memory. The illusion of detachment is a consequence of the phenomenon of inattentional blindness, a goal-driven yet unconscious mechanism that prevents distractors from entering consciousness so that we can devote our full attention to a specific task. The classic example of inattentional blindness is Simons and Chabrice's invisible gorilla experiment. When asked to count the number of passes that the team wearing white makes, most people that watch this video miss the gorilla. It is not that we cannot perceive the gorilla. We can, but we unconsciously choose to ignore it. And we do so probably because we take the gorilla for one of the players wearing black, and because focusing on what the members of the black team do is not relevant to our current goal. The loss of awareness comes then from how a sustained focus of attention on the task at hand brings the task at hand into consciousness in the expectation of a payout. In this case, the payout would be the satisfaction of successfully counting the number of passes that the white team makes. It is a rather small payout, yet sufficient to grab our attention and make the task reign in consciousness. According to the thesis of modularity, the brain is composed of highly interconnected yet relatively autonomous specialized networks called modules. Each module serves a specific function. Consciousness results from the meaningful integration of the processes performed by these modules. Consciousness function is to predict the future, formulate plans of action based on existing information provided by unconscious processes, to maximize the chances of obtaining a reward or minimizing a risk. Selective attention is necessary because of the capacity limits of consciousness, which Ledoux equals to those of working memory. Because an important part of minimizing risks is being able to make fast decisions, consciousness can only process a minimum amount of information at any given time. Notwithstanding these limits, consciousness is quite flexible in regards to the kind of information it lets in. Gazzaniga compares the process through which relatively independent mental modules produce consciousness to bubbles of boiling water popping continuously, and as they do, gaining control of the mind. The heat that makes these bubbles surge are attention mechanisms modulated by arousal, the autonomic and hormonal responses caused by an emotional episode. Arousal is a mechanism through which emotions wake up the brain to make it more receptive, lock attention, enhance our ability to store content in memory, and ready the body for action. Under this view, emotions are an idea's ticket into consciousness. According to Ledoux, emotions are the expression of neural circuits involved in defense, maintenance of energy and nutritional supplies, fluid balance, thermoregulation, and reproduction. Emotions act as an interior reward and punishment system that informs an animal how it is faring in the quest for survival. For instance, anger signals that a goal has failed but that it can be reinstated if we put up a fight. Sadness indicates that a goal is irrevocably lost. Joy signals that our goal has just been attained or is nearly accomplished. Contentment signals that we have reached satiation and we can take a rest. According to appraisal theories of emotion, an emotional response follows the unconscious appraisal of a stimulus as a potential threat, a reward, or as something not relevant to our survival. The process through which emotions drive thoughts into consciousness is not linear, though. It is a rather complex one, dependent on the assessment of the relative pleasantness of a stimulus, but also on experience, exposure to goal-relevant or inherently emotional stimuli and distractors, as well as on the quality of the interconnectivity of the cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex with the limbic region. Similarly, different emotional responses follow different neural circuits. The battle for consciousness is then a battle between top-down and bottom-up attention processes inhibiting each other through their emotional weight. Which goal will prevail depends on the integration of sensory information with concepts stored in memory and our ability to extract new meaning from them, but also on how these memories link to an emotion. The stimulus with the higher emotional weight is the one that wins control of consciousness. Ledoux proposes that the amygdala is the area responsible for assessing the emotional significance of a stimuli through two different neural pathways. In the low road, the amygdala receives rough and unfiltered sensory information through its connections to the thalamus before that same information can reach the cortex where it can be appropriately interpreted. The low road accounts for less accurate, yet faster responses which come useful in situations where the time is crucial, as would be the sudden appearance of a predator. In the high road, the amygdala receives information already processed by the cortex, not so much so that better responses could be made, Ledoux argues, but so that inappropriate responses could be inhibited. This diagram is oversimplified, of course, and gives too much decision power to the amygdala. Recent research proposes that rather than assigning affective valence to a stimulus, the amygdala responds to the intensity of affect, and the process of assigning emotional valence to a stimulus may involve more brain regions, like the anterior cingulate cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the thalamus. For instance, these diagrams here are for the functional connectivity of the amygdala under circumstances of conscious and non-conscious fear, per an article by Williams and colleagues, who used fMRI to identify the regions of interest. Green arrows represent positive functional connectivity, and red arrows represent negative connectivity. However the valence of a stimulus is first assessed, the intensity of an emotional response or arousal is what determines whether the significance of a stimulus will capture attention, enter consciousness, and remain in consciousness for long. Recent research links the secretion of the neurotransmitter orexin by the lateral hypothalamus to arousal promoting appetitive and exploratory behaviors, in addition to arousal that promotes wakefulness following circadian rhythms. This diagram shows the neural connections of the hypothalamic area with the ventral tegmental area, which produces dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with learning, attention, and motivation, the locus coeruleus, which produces norepinephrine, another promoter of attention and facilitator of learning, the tuberomammillary nucleus, which produces histamine, promoter of wakefulness, the raphe nuclei in the brain stem, which produces serotonin, which modulates aversion to risk, and thus it is associated with reduced levels of aggression, and the laterodorsal and pedunculopontine tegmental nuclei in the brain stem, which produce acetylcholine, another promoter of attention, as well as with the prefrontal, somatosensory, and association cortices. In simpler words, regardless of its valence as either positive or negative, the higher the emotional significance of a stimulus, the stronger the arousal it will produce, and the higher the likelihood that perception of that stimulus will enter consciousness. It takes more than one strong emotion to engage, however. It takes a goal. When we recognize a stimulus as neither relevant to our current goals nor inherently threatening, other stimuli capture our attention, gaining control of consciousness. Goals are necessary condition for engagement because goals set the measure against which stimuli are categorized, making them emotionally relevant. Without goals, all stimuli are equally irrelevant. By inducing feelings of empathy for a character, stories impose this character's goals on the receivers. Similarly, games impose a goal by challenging the player with a mission. We do not accept these goals imposed by a story or a game just out of the blue, however. An original goal must precede the acceptance of these arbitrary goals. This original goal may be the desire to feel a certain feeling, as mood adjustment theory suggests. Oliver and Rainey propose that consumers engage in entertainment following not only hedonic motivations which bring pleasure, but also eudaimonic motivations which bring feelings of personal development and insight. In their temporary expansion of the boundaries of the self thesis, Slater and colleagues propose a desire for exploring a different reality coming from the awareness of self-regulation. Either way, the expected result is emotional change, to feel happier, wiser, excited, or just temporarily different. If emotions that result in rewarding feelings are the way our genes make sure we do those things that will improve our chances of survival, lending our attention to media content becomes a tool to artificially provoke those rewarding feelings. Thus, the initial hook to engage are cues that suggest that the receiver will experience a certain feeling. We may also choose to engage trying to avoid boredom, the aversive experience of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. Boredom follows a loss of attention to the current task due to this task losing emotional significance. Boredom may originate from a neutral emotional state of low arousal, which derives first in mind wandering, permitting the entrance of new ideas into consciousness, then into an aversive state of high arousal, as an individual comes to realize how unrewarding the current situation is. Boredom has been associated with anger, frustration, hostility, sadness, motor impulsiveness, and when it reaches a chronic state, life dissatisfaction, lack of meaning, and depression. Thus, we have an inherent desire to avoid boredom. Now, if for a message to be engaging, it must reign in consciousness, and for a thought to enter consciousness, the stimulus that this thought represents must have sufficient emotional relevance, and this emotional relevance comes from setting a goal that allows to categorize the valence and saliency of the stimulus. Why do we tend to disengage and get bored even when we have clear goals? Bench and Lynch propose that boredom function is to signal the brain to seek for more rewarding goals. Kurzman and colleagues propose that the mind tends to disengage not so much because cognition is expensive, but because investing too much time in a non-rewarding activity increases opportunity costs, leading to a sensation of effort that leads to frustration and boredom. Thus, to remain engaged, the current activity must be perceived as potentially more rewarding than investing our time and attention in anything else. Whether correct or not, this perception provides the motivation to persist. The opposite of boredom would be a highly engaging experience, that is, one of flow. Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory proposes that flow comes from introducing challenge, but only when this challenge matches or is slightly above our skills. Thus, enjoyment is maximized by challenges that are not too easy and not too difficult. Abu Hamdeh and Csikszentmihalyi note that part of the enjoyment of an engaging activity comes from the suspense of not knowing what the ultimate outcome will be. Then ask, why don't individuals always enjoy high levels of challenge? The dopamine prediction error hypothesis may provide an answer to this question. The hypothesis proposes that the firing of the dopaminergic neurons in the mesolimbic pathway is proportional to a cost-benefit valuation of attaining a goal. Dopaminergic neurons in the mesolimbic pathway will fire more frequently in response to unexpected rewards, lower their firing rate to predicted rewards, and have an almost null rate of firing in response to a lack of reward. The prediction error would be the difference between what was received and what was expected. The higher the prediction error, the higher the release of dopamine, and thus the lesser the inclination to disengage attention. Since the costs of engaging attention refer to opportunity costs rather than to actual cognitive efforts, which must be equal or lower to the expected rewards, and the value of a reward refers to its perceived utility rather than to its objective value, indicated here by the sigmoidal blue curve, what the dopamine prediction error hypothesis suggests is that when a task seems too difficult or too easy, the cost-benefit valuation of persistence will be negative. The sweet spot of engagement is then when the reward utility of remaining engaged is perceived as higher than the utility of engaging with anything else. What challenge does is to amplify the difference between the perceived opportunity costs and perceived reward utility, making rewards seem unexpected and motivating us to remain engaged. The dopamine prediction error hypothesis also suggests that reward uncertainty has an effect on motivation because rewards seem to come as a function of one's persistence rather than one's effort. And Selman Robinson proposed that the function of motivation is precisely to compensate for our inability to make accurate predictions, and argued that if reward uncertainty were not a source of motivation, most behaviors would extinguish because of the high failure and energy loss experienced by animals. Now, after all this explanation, going back to our original question, how can one make media experiences more engaging? Let us review how engaging stories do it. In their extended transportation imagery model, Van Laer and colleagues propose that inclusion of identifiable characters, an imaginable plot, and verisimilitude as a story's necessary elements to induce a state of narrative transportation given the attributes of the recipient. The identifiable characters come with goals, which successfully transported individuals will make their own. The plot provides conflict, and this conflict represents the challenge that will keep us engaged. While we are engaged with a story, we are constantly trying to anticipate what will happen next. A roller coaster of emotions is then necessary to make our plot predictions fail constantly so that the rewards come better than expected. If the rewards solve their problems in a predictable manner, it may be more rewarding to engage in anything else. A continuous shower of rewards won't work, Because reward utility does not grow in a linear but a sigmoidal fashion, the blue curve, implying diminishing returns. In other words, story characters must suffer and suffer continuously so that the way in which every subsequent reward delivers them to their goals is appreciated. Moreover, since negative effect translates to the release of stress hormones in the bloodstream, and since the changes that adrenaline brings can be felt and cortisol lingers longer than necessary, the effect of stress adds up, provoking more intense feelings, which leads recipients to misinterpret the importance of new stimuli presented in a story. Finally, what verisimilitude does is to provide a series of rules to serve as a baseline from which to make sensitive predictions. Lack of realism, especially lack of narrative consistency, hinders our ability to create a theory of mind, perhaps because the brain cannot establish a relationship between what is and what should be. Thus, story events must be predictable yet come unpredicted for a story to be engaging. To those three basic elements, I would add what Green and Brock call a storyteller's artistic craftsmanship in their transportation imagery models, fourth postulate, and properly exploring the affordances of the medium included in Green and Brock's fifth postulate. These last two elements refer to a harmonious arrangement of the previous three elements. They can enhance the chances of creating an engaging experience, but are not as important and will never replace the first three elements. Good prose by itself cannot create a good story, but a good story can survive terrible prose. Likewise, the most amazing special effects cannot improve a predictable or utterly unrealistic movie. Video games make use of the same elements. Video games impose a goal when they set a mission. They provide challenge with obstacles and enemies to defeat. And they bound those challenges in a series of rules that allow players to make realistic predictions of the consequences of their actions. Good design can improve the sensation of presence and provide mastery of control, but it cannot replace the role that the other three elements play. Similarly, properly exploiting the medium affordances to its fullest can improve the sensation of presence, but presence alone cannot bring sustained engagement. So a few questions remain. Can these elements increase engagement across media? Can one predict engagement by measuring arousal? What role plays interactivity? I ran a pilot study that compared the emotional arousal provoked by comparable messages across different media. The arousal provoked by 3D manipulable objects was higher than that provoked by video and 2D pictures, but the differences were not significant. The arousal provoked by augmented reality was significant, however, and for augmented reality, arousal also significantly predicted self-reported levels of engagement, although not for the other experiences. Since the augmented reality and 3D manipulable object experiences varied only on the background presented, in the case of augmented reality, the real world, and in the case of 3D objects, just a white background, the difference could have been caused by a higher perceived realism. Another question that remains is how do media experiences satisfy one's need for autonomy and relatedness? Per self-determination theory, intrinsic motivation is a function of satisfying one's psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. If the effect of challenge can be explained by the dopamine prediction error hypothesis, and challenge satisfies our need for competence, what explains the satisfaction of what explains the effect of satisfying the needs for autonomy and relatedness in engagement? Well, that's all for now. Stay tuned for more of my research. Thank you very much for your attention.